Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer has finally arrived in theatres, and there's a lot to break down in the auteur filmmaker's latest film. Whether it's the subjective colour scenes, including Oppenheimer's early life, the development of the bomb and the later trial, or the objective black and white sequences from the point of view of Robert Downey Jr.'s Louis Strauss. So I'm going to be breaking down the plot and explaining the ending for Oppenheimer to help you guys put together a much greater picture of the overall story. This video will be especially useful for those who haven't read the book because there's a lot of historical details that expand on J. Robert Oppenheimer's life. I will also be making much more content in the coming days, including a biggest questions video, so stay tuned for all of it on my channel over the coming weeks. But as a last warning, this analysis will contain spoilers, so if you do happen to be someone who hasn't seen the film yet, then I would recommend watching this upload after you've seen it. Before I get into it though, if you want to keep up to date on any of my upcoming content for Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, then don't forget to support this upload by giving it a like rating, subscribing to the channel, and turning on your notifications. But without further ado, let's dive into Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer Explained. So Oppenheimer has everything you'd want from a Christopher Nolan film, and that includes cutting between different narrative threads in time to tell a more compelling picture of this real-life story. It's almost like two films combined to really examine not just the build-up and aftermath of the atomic bomb's creation at Los Alamos, but also the effects it had on its creator towards the world that he forever changed. In the subjective colour scenes, we see everything from Oppenheimer's perspective, focusing on his early life, the development of the bomb in New Mexico, and the trial afterwards. While the objective black and white is from the point of view of Robert Downey Jr. after the Trinity test, which includes detailing a personal vendetta against Oppenheimer, resulting in a somewhat parallel hearing at the end. I have read the American Prometheus book that this film is based on, and the history that's detailed there is presented in a unique way in the movie through structure and how Nolan integrates the black and white and colour. And because there's a lot of jumping between different sequences, the best way to break it down is to go through the story from start to finish chronologically. So let's get straight into it and discuss the history from beginning to end that is shown in Nolan's latest film. The movie opens with text referencing the myth of Prometheus, a titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. And we know that this myth ended with horrible consequences. It's a perfect table setter for a 3-hour biopic thriller about a US tragedy that has all of the mythic realism and scope that this story demands. The story is not linear, and we actually start where the film ends, with a moment that is sure to be expanded upon by the time we revisit it. Louis Strauss oversees Oppenheimer and Einstein speaking at the lake near the Institute for Advanced Study, a place where Oppenheimer would later be in a moment of exile and where he would struggle with inner trauma. Strauss doesn't hear what the two of them talk about, but it's clear in the many scenes that follow that he has suspicions over Oppenheimer surrounding his links to communism and believes he has poisoned Einstein against him. They are friendly to begin with, and it's Strauss that introduces Oppie to the Institute, but years later the relationship breaks down after Oppenheimer publicly humiliates him, resulting in Strauss bearing a lifelong grudge against him. We get the introduction of both Oppenheimer and Strauss's trials, and these are woven into numerous moments throughout the film. Oppenheimer's trial is about deciding whether his security clearance should be revoked, and Strauss's hearing in black and white is regarding his motives and involvement in the period of McCarthyism. I will come back to these trials towards the end of this breakdown. So following our introduction to the different intercutting narrative threads, we start to follow Oppenheimer during his early life in university and learning about the worrying yet scientific evolution that was going on during that period of time. While he was gifted in academic theory, at Cambridge he was struggling to find his voice. He was bad at practical work, which his professor pointed out, the same one who he later attempts to poison by injecting an apple with potassium cyanide. However, However, after being inspired by a lecture given by Kenneth Branagh's Niels Bohr, he had a change of heart and removed the apple from his professor's office. In the American Prometheus book, Bohr is a sort of prophet for Oppie, and his idea of wanting openness that is argued throughout the film is a shared ideology by the both of them. On the advice of Bohr, Oppenheimer leaves Cambridge for the University of Göttingen in Germany, which is the heart of theoretical physics in Europe. We soon learn that developments are made in quantum physics, and at Göttingen, this was especially exciting for bright minds like Oppenheimer. He was able to work under people like Matthias Schweighöfer's Werner Heisenberg and Enrico Fermi, and he quickly becomes well respected in the laboratory. Oppenheimer learns much from the scientist Heisenberg, with whom he would later be in a somewhat race, as he was responsible for the German bomb effort, which never fully came to fruition. So after becoming an important member of the physics community, Oppenheimer then returned to America with the goal of bringing quantum innovations with him. At Berkeley University, he became a professor and built and developed a department for physics. After initially struggling to engage with students and construct lectures, over time, he would deliver eloquent lectures that many students attended. Working with Josh Hartnett's Ernest Lawrence, he forms a class, which in the book is known as Oppie's Boys, and using his platform, he's determined to push forward the quantum physics that was introduced to him in Germany. So Berkeley was the fresh start that Oppenheimer needed, but as we soon learn, things began to take a turn. And this is to do with his involvement in politics, a result of what was going on in World War II with the Nazis, and although it wasn't common knowledge, Oppenheimer was also Jewish. Oppenheimer's involvement with communism really all kicked off after a radical woman known as Jean Tatlock, who is played by Florence Pugh in the movie, greets him at a Communist Party gathering. We get a steamy scene between them where Oppie even recites the Bhagavad Gita, a Hindu scripture that he famously quotes during the Trinity test later on in the film. Jean is a psychology student at Berkeley, but she's also a member of the Communist Party. Being a part of the Communist Party during this time was not out of the ordinary given the situation surrounding the war against Hitler and the Nazis. At the time, the Communist Party worked for fairer wages and helping refugees, which Oppenheimer also contributed to with giving money to the Spanish war effort. So the communists were against fascism, and it was Jean who really introduced him to the cause, which he was happy to help with. He was not a fully fledged member of the Communist Party, but he did subscribe to a lot of their ideas. And of course, he was in love with Jean, and through her, he became friends with Chevalier, and both of these relationships would eventually become some of the biggest obstacles for Oppenheimer during his later trial. His brother Frank was also a part of the Communist Party, creating yet more fuel for the US government to use against him. And as he becomes more involved with the party, we see in the film that Ernest Lawrence scolds him for bringing his left-wing political views into the classroom, believing that they should be kept separate from the science. Although Oppenheimer had become more connected to communists, it's learned that his connections were not too radical or extensive from his perspective. And his actions really highlighted that. He broke up with Jean and met Emily Blunt's Kitty, who also leaves the Communist Party, and it was clear that this was the woman he was destined to be with. Kitty had previously been married 3 times, but after meeting Oppie and spending time together, both in the US and in New Mexico, they soon get married. So this foundation brings us to the formation of the Manhattan Project. Due to World War II and the looming threat of the Nazis completing their bomb first, it was time to progress from using theory alone. As Oppie and Ernest Lawrence say in the film, theory will only take you so far. After a new revelation in physics, it became clear to Oppie that he had to get involved in the war effort. On the day his paper on black holes was published, that groundbreaking work was overshadowed by Hitler invading Poland, which is exactly how it plays out in the book, and I'm definitely happy that Nolan included that detail in the film too. On top of this though, another scientific discovery was soon made. It was made known that when you bombard a uranium nucleus with neutrons, the nucleus can be split and a huge amount of energy can be released. This led to there being a recognition that a chain reaction could be created with lots of neutrons. So essentially, nuclear fission could be utilised to create a very powerful bomb, and the fear was that the Nazis, with a lot of the greatest scientists, could harness that and be the first to develop an atomic weapon. So Oppenheimer drops a lot of his political associations and is eventually visited by Matt Damon's Leslie Groves, head of the Nuclear Department Project by the National Defense Research Council, and he is tasked with appointing the head of the Manhattan Project. With Oppenheimer desperately wanting to get involved in helping the war effort, and Groves being the only one who saw that this man can do it, he was chosen by him. We learn that the government wasn't interested in approaching Oppenheimer because they knew of his potential radical ties, and they didn't want to expose top secrets to someone that they thought was a potential security risk. But after some pushing from Groves and some work from Oppie, he is eventually placed in charge of the project to design the bomb itself, and he gets his security clearance. Groves was adamant that the project be kept a complete secret, but Oppenheimer advised that this secrecy would hurt the scientists' work and slow down the overall progress of the project. So an extension of the openness that Niels Bohr inspired during the earlier moments in Oppenheimer's life comes into practice. Both Groves and Oppie picked out the perfect location for the Manhattan Project, an isolated mesa in Los Alamos, New Mexico. Oppie got his dream of combining New Mexico and physics. The top scientists could work together here, bring their families and live there. Oppenheimer recruited some of his own students, but mainly some of the world's leading physicians, which included Hans Bethe, Edward Teller, Isidore Rabi, and Ernest Lawrence. And while there were poor conditions here, they were all able to thrive in this location with a shared noble goal in mind: create an atomic bomb before the Nazis do. However, there were issues during the bomb project, and the main one links into that issue of secrecy that I discussed before. There were complaints from the scientists about the excessive security measures conducted by the military, and as we learn later on in the film, the military had tapped Oppenheimer's phone and kept him under constant surveillance. Additionally, Oppenheimer had to resolve disputes between scientists and the military, striving to keep their focus. Edward Teller proposed that they use hydrogen to construct the bomb, as it would result in a blast equating to megatons. Oppenheimer believed that this was excessive and dismissed the idea. There's another moment where Teller becomes frustrated and threatens to leave Los Alamos, but Oppie convinces him to stay by promising that they'll have an hour in the lab together once a week. He kept the scientists and military happy, and after multiple implosion tests and design work, they had all accomplished what once seemed impossible, and that was detonating an atomic weapon. While it was difficult to construct the bomb and create a nuclear chain reaction that they could control, what remained unclear was what would happen afterwards as a result of the blast. There was the tiniest possibility that an explosion could ignite the atmosphere and destroy all life on Earth. While this was a huge risk, they formulated two bomb designs, one named Fat Man and another named Little Boy. The latter, which was eventually dropped over Hiroshima, used a gun assembly method where uranium-235 is fired at another mass of U-235. When they combine, they form a critical mass, starting a nuclear reaction. On the other hand, Fat Man, the bomb used in Nagasaki, was a plutonium bomb using implosion. With this method, plutonium is surrounded by explosives, and once activated, it's compressed and another nuclear reaction is set off. They were less sure that this method would work, and that's why we see them carry out more implosion tests. While the production of the bombs was a big issue they got around, some of the other issues that are excellently conveyed in the film surround the political and moral implications of using the weapon, especially when they find out that Hitler is dead and the Germans have surrendered. Oppenheimer starts holding discussions among the scientists at Los Alamos, continuing the idea of openness that he and Bohr wanted to push for, to on one hand discuss the dangers of nuclear power, and two, debate the justifications of using the bomb on Japan. While the Japanese were close to surrendering as well, they felt to protect the United States and to sustain a future where there would be no more war, using this weapon was necessary to ensure this. In the midst of deciding what they were going to do and what targets they were going to hit, Oppenheimer was also met with a tragedy. His once lover Jean Tatlock had died after drowning in her bathtub, and as detailed in the trials later on, it's not clear whether she drowned herself or whether someone had killed her. She was desperate for company after quitting the Communist Party, and Oppie promised he'd be there for her, but during the Los Alamos project, he only met with her once in an intimate encounter. So he cut ties with Jean, and his relationship with her would come back to haunt him in the trials, which again I'll go into at the end. And this brings us to the Trinity tests that this whole project has been building up to. They selected an area isolated in the middle of the desert, codenamed Trinity, a reference to a John Donne poem who Oppenheimer and his former lover Jean Tatlock admired. In the scene itself, we get hours cut down into just a few minutes, showcasing the risk and rising tension involved. We also learn of the storm that delays the test, how Oppie tells Kitty that she can bring in the sheets if it works, and the many scientists gathering at the Trinity site to perform the test. Ludwig Göransson's horror-like score builds and builds using violin sounds until the countdown timer runs out, the flash of light is shown, and we see it from multiple perspectives around the bunker. It's exactly like it plays out in the book, with Oppenheimer reciting the I am become death, the destroyer of worlds scripture, and many of those at the site describing the colours and silence of the moment before the massive shockwave hits. It ends with the scientists beginning to cheer, and there's this sense of relief that the mission had paid off with the gadget succeeding. But the reaction to atomic weapons quickly began to change. Some of the scientists had realised that their hard work had created the most destructive killing machine, and this was especially the case when they were used in Japan after the targets of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been selected by the government. The majority of the US supported the bomb's use in Japan, and a majority of the scientists who worked at Los Alamos supported it too. And while Oppenheimer was initially pleased to hear that the gadget worked, their usage on civilians made him fear the consequences of a nuclear world. Like in the book, Hiroshima is only heard on the radio by Oppenheimer and others, and you get their reactions to it, not a visualization of the moment it went off. However, what Nolan does highlight is the brutal consequences of the weapon, and that takes form in one of the most powerful visual moments in the film during Oppenheimer's victory speech at Los Alamos. He congratulates the effort of those involved on the project, but in that very speech, we go inside of his mind to visualize the trauma that he now has to live with. He pictures people burnt and children incinerated in the blast all around the hall where people are celebrating. It's a striking scene that really communicates the horror that these weapons can cause, and that really translates into how Oppenheimer feels and his stance from that moment on surrounding the development of more bombs, and more specifically, the hydrogen bomb in an accelerating arms race. While Oppenheimer was not against nuclear weapons, he felt responsible for introducing them, and he felt like it was his duty to try and influence how they were used in the future. After being appointed as the chairman of the General Advisory Committee and beginning to have disagreements with members of the government, including Louis Strauss, he argued that the US should tell the Soviets about the Manhattan Project in the hopes of avoiding a future arms race. The government rejected this, kept the bomb program a secret, and charged ahead for control of power. Oppenheimer meets with the then president in the Oval Office, which is a fantastic and single scene with Gary Oldman's Harry Truman. He crumbles in front of the president, revealing to him that he feels like he has blood on his hands, and once the meeting ends and Oppie makes his way to the door, Truman calls him a crybaby scientist. While Oppenheimer was intent on stopping the development of more bombs, something that just wasn't working in that toxic political sphere, it's key to note that Edward Teller had stayed at Los Alamos to work on the hydrogen bomb, which is hundreds of times more powerful than the ones dropped in Japan. Japan. So even after serving his country as well as he did and trying to make a better future for the world as a whole, Oppenheimer failed to stand up to the government, and eventually his stance towards the hydrogen bomb was enough to destroy his celebrity scientist persona and give fuel for the US government to destroy him too. And that brings us to the trials of Oppenheimer. These are intercut throughout the movie and work in tandem with all the other moments in the film, which I've described up until this point. One for Oppenheimer's security clearance, and the other for a hearing with Louis Strauss. Starting with Oppie's trial, we learn that a lot of the evidence put against him comes from unnamed individuals and from illegal wiretaps, which had not been disclosed to him or his lawyer. Plus, if this trial had taken place in an actual courtroom, the evidence wouldn't have been allowed to be used or considered as evidence. So there are just a few elements of this trial that were sketchy, and as we soon find out, a lot of it was under the hands of Louis Strauss. The trial was actually intended to bring him down using his communist connections more than it was surrounding his attitude towards the hydrogen bomb. And that again screamed of relations to the personal vendetta that Strauss built against him after facing his own humiliation earlier on. The trial scenes involved those coming forward to defend Oppie, but it only served to give Jason Clarke's Roger Robb and the other individuals in the room more evidence to destroy him. Leslie Groves, Matthew Modine's Vannevar Bush, Isidore Rabi and Kitty were involved, with the latter being one of the only people to convincingly defend him. And that's because she was really the only person who truly understood him, and like we see in the trials, she knows that this is a losing game and gives them the sort of arrogance that they were giving to Oppenheimer. On the other hand, Edward Teller testified against him, having been outraged towards Oppenheimer's feelings on the hydrogen bomb. So even with most speaking in his defense, the prosecutors were able to construct evidence that would hurt him, and the main piece of evidence was the event from the 40s where Oppenheimer's friend Chevalier tried to get him to pass information about the bomb project to the Soviets. Oppenheimer had refused at the time, but in the years after, we learned that he chose not to mention anything about the incident nor Chevalier to the government. And when he eventually did, he still never mentioned Chevalier's name, as he was protecting his friend. This, combined with knowledge of his affair with Jean Tatlock and all the other connections he had to members of the party, was all the prosecution needed. There's an effective moment in the trial where Kitty imagines Oppenheimer having sex with Jean at the table he sat at, and after the proceeding ends, she says to Robert that she's fed up with the prosecution, analysing every part of their lives, and Oppenheimer's seeming lack of desire to defend himself. It makes you only imagine how they must have been feeling, and it really taps into the damage that it did to them even after this trial ended. With the exhausting hearing having come to an end, the security board voted against Oppenheimer maintaining his security clearance, and while they stated that there was no evidence that he was ever a communist himself, they claimed that his behaviour had shown bad judgment. If you know the story, Oppenheimer went into exile, and while it was humiliating for him then, McCarthyism did eventually die out, and the US was embarrassed by their treatment of him. In fact, the AEC awarded him the Enrico Fermi Award for excellence in the field of nuclear research, and we see this in the film with Cillian Murphy as an aged Oppenheimer. At that ceremony, Kitty refuses to shake the hand of Edward Teller, who won the same award the year before, showing that she would never forget the ordeal that they were put through. And this brings us to the other hearing in the movie, one that again we return to throughout the film in black and white. With the hearing focusing on his appointment at the US Secretary of Commerce, Louis Strauss goes into detail about why he had problems with Oppenheimer. Ultimately, it came down to a few reasons. The initial one was the humiliation that he suffered at the hands of him in a public hearing, and the other stemmed from his own paranoia surrounding a conversation between Oppenheimer and Einstein at the lake. He thought that Oppenheimer had poisoned Einstein against him, and his hatred towards Oppie would become his own professional downfall. In Strauss's hearing, he was refused a higher position because many scientists and key figures, including Rami Malek's David Hill, shed light on his involvement in Oppenheimer's humiliating trials. It was science versus politics, and the idea of loyalty had been thrown out of the window. The movie questions what it means to be loyal to your country and how you react when that loyalty is questioned. But with Strauss, it was a vendetta and a case of not understanding Oppenheimer's stance on nuclear energy, nor what he said to Einstein at that lake. And the final scene reveals exactly what was said, ending very close to where the film began. At the beginning, we saw Strauss watching Oppie and Einstein's conversation from a distance, but here we see the discussion from the perspective of Oppenheimer. Einstein gives him some wisdom about his life and the bleak future that he will face. He says that while the world has gotten what they wanted from him, the medals and praise he receives will eventually lead to the world shunning him. This leads into a conversation about the atomic bomb itself, and specifically how the blast of the bomb might have triggered a chain reaction and ignited the atmosphere. Oppenheimer and Einstein's conversation ends with the former questioning whether his invention has destroyed the world anyway, because its very existence and the bigger bombs that were going to be built could result in complete annihilation. And after a brief visual of a nuclear silo, Oppenheimer stares deeply at the pond, and we are presented with his mind's final image. The film leaves us with a horrifying vision of Earth from space being destroyed in a nuclear war and blasts spreading across the planet. It's the perfect way to end the film, making the underlying fear that runs throughout it even clearer to the audience, and we end up wondering whether today's issues could eventually lead to this. Of course, Oppenheimer's tale has a lot of conundrums, and during that period, they had to develop nuclear weapons because of Hitler and World War II, and the use of them in Japan will hopefully mean that they are never used again. But the hand on the doomsday clock has inched closer to midnight, and the film absolutely serves as a cautionary tale, not just for questioning loyalty, but also for the potential consequences of using these missiles as a tool for genocide and even wiping out life on Earth entirely. But that was my video explaining the plot and ending for Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. Like I said in my spoiler-free review, this film is a spectacular cinematic achievement, and there's going to be plenty of discussion about it in the coming weeks, surrounding the questions raised by this ending, the movie's overall quality, the adaptation of the book, and the narrative's central themes. But I do hope this breakdown did help some of you guys understand the events and smaller details a bit better, and overall, I'm looking forward to hearing what your thoughts were on the film, so don't forget to let me know down below in the comments section. Again, I will also be doing lots of Oppenheimer videos during release week, including a biggest questions upload, where I go into more that I haven't talked about here, and a spoiler-filled essay discussing why I think Christopher Nolan's latest feature is a masterpiece. So keep a lookout for whenever I post, and make sure you don't miss any of it. For much more on Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, then subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications. Also, if you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like, rating, and follow me on social media via the links in the description. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I've been Cortex, and as always, make some noise.